You are listening to the GodArchy podcast, where we shove a crowbar between state and church. This is the spot where Christian faith intersects with libertarian anarchism and voluntaryism. I'm your host, Mike Meharry. In this episode, we're going to talk about inflation. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the GodArchy podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I very much appreciate the fact that you've taken time out of your busy day to listen to the show. Today, we're going to talk about inflation, the Federal Reserve, and basically how the government is stealing from you. Of course, government steals from you in many, many ways. Inflation is one of them. And the fact that most people are economically illiterate and ignorant makes this theft possible. So I want to do my part to erase the ignorance. So we're going to look at inflation. What is it really? How is it stealing from you? And what kind of biblical spiritual perspective can we put on that? Before we dig into that topic, I have a question for you. Have you tried Fox & Sons coffee yet? Now, if you haven't, you should. My wife, who is the coffee connoisseur here at the Meharry household, tells me that Fox & Sons Dark Roast is the best dark roast coffee that she's had. And there's also a light roast available if dark roast isn't your thing. I'm assuming that it is as good as the dark roast. We're talking organically roasted whole bean coffee here. And of course, if you buy from Fox & Sons, you're also supporting a cool family business that is meant to leave a legacy. My friend Steve, he wants to leave a legacy for his son. He's a Christian, he's a libertarian, so you're supporting a great small business. But most importantly for you, you're getting excellent coffee at a low price. And I'm going to make that price even lower for you. If you go to foxndsons.com, F-O-X-N-N, Sons, foxndsons.com, use the promo code GodArchy. You will get 20% off any order over $25 using that promo code. That is now through the end of November. So you know what? Maybe you should buy some coffee as a present for one of your coffee drinking friends. Great gift idea, and you can save a little money. So check it out. Again, Fox Sons, Foxnsons.com, and check out the products that are available and get yourself some good coffee. Also, remember, you can support GodArchy. You can do it in two ways. One, please share these episodes, share the articles over at godarchy.org. Talk about it on social media. That will help expand our reach and allow us to get more people listening to and watching, not watching, I guess you can't watch podcasts, but listening to the show. And also, you can support GodArchy financially through a monthly donation. I rejected Patreon just because, got my own system set up. You go to godarchy.org, supporting listeners. It'll walk you through the process. I very much covet your support. The more support that I get from you folks who are listening to the show, the more that I can do with GodArchy moving forward. So please consider a monthly donation. We're talking $5 a month, $10 a month, and that will really help expand and make GodArchy even better than it is now. So support the show, check that out, and let's talk about inflation. So as I said, in essence, the government is stealing from you. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not using hyperbole. Inflation decreases your purchasing power. So, in other words, your $1 won't buy what your $1 bought yesterday as inflation increases. It's stealing your purchasing power. It's devaluing your money. And of course, you're experiencing this every day right now. We're having historically high inflation. And you feel the impacts of that every time you go to the grocery store, every time you go to the mall. Well, I don't guess anybody goes to the mall anymore. Anytime you go to Target, anytime you go to the gas station, you're paying more for everything. That is the impact of inflation. But most people don't have any clue what's going on. And that's because, as I said earlier, most people are economically ignorant. And I don't mean that as an insult. When I say ignorance, I mean they just don't know. People don't know. Economics is not taught. Most people think economics is boring. I'm doing my best here not to make it boring, but most people have that perception. You think economics, oh God, I'm going to have to do charts and graphs and math. No, not really. It's interesting and it's important because it's impacting you every single day of your life. And, here's what's scary about economic ignorance. Even though most people are economically ignorant, they have vociferous opinions about economics that they express on a regular basis that drives economic policy from the government level, because the government says, oh, well, the people want this, so we're going to give it to them. And you get it good and hard. So we need to understand economics. And again, I'm hoping I can do this in a way that is interesting, that you'll enjoy listening to, but will help communicate the realities that we're facing and what exactly is happening to your money. So to demonstrate the economic ignorance that is out there, specifically as it relates to inflation, there was a poll commissioned by Newsweek, and the results recently came out. 63% of the respondents said that they agreed that the U.S. government should issue new stimulus checks to tackle inflation. 42% said they strongly agree with that. Only 18% actually disagreed that the U.S. government should send out inflation stimmy checks. Now, those of you that understand inflation are going, oh my gosh, that's stupid. Some of you who don't understand the mechanism of inflation, might be thinking, well, that's not a bad idea. I could certainly use a check. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I could use a check, right? We could all use a check. But stimulus checks are one of the reasons we're dealing with the effects of inflation today. Now, again, I can't blame people for wanting more checks, right? First off, most people think government money is free. So when they see stimulus, they think, oh, I'm getting free money. Government's handing out money. I should get mine, right? And of course, everybody's feeling the pain of inflation. As I said, every time you fill up your gas tank, every time you go get groceries, you're feeling that pain of inflation. A check would certainly help relieve that pain for at least a minute. And don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying the impacts of inflation as I'm talking about this. Here's the reality. Even based on a rigged CPI that really minimizes the impacts of inflation, prices are up over 8% year on year. And if they actually used a more honest formula to measure the consumer price index, like the formula they used back in the 70s and 80s, which honestly was probably still rigged, but it was better than the one we have now, CPI would be closer to 16%. So we're in a time that inflation is really realistically as high as it's ever been, including the stagflationary days in the 1970s. Now, meanwhile, your wages aren't keeping up with rising prices. And here's a myth. You'll hear this all the time. Well, inflation really isn't that bad, Mike, because, inflation drives up wages too. So ultimately, it's a wash. Yes, your grandparents only had to pay 25 cents for a loaf of bread, but they made a whole lot less money. So, it's all kind of washed out. No, your wages never keep up with increasing prices. Right now, real average hourly earnings have decreased by 3%. That's from September 2021 to September 2022. So you're making 3% less in terms of purchasing power than you were a year ago, even though you probably got a raise. So this idea that inflation is fine because it all comes out in the wash, well, it doesn't. Or if it does, it's a long way down the road. Meanwhile, you're losing purchasing power. You're feeling that pain. So don't let these government people lie to you and gaslight you and tell you, oh, no, this is not bad. Because they're trying to tell you that inflation is good for you. You see these dumb articles all the time. So you know better. You know the impact on your own budget. You see that in real life. So it's no wonder that people are clamoring for more stimulus. But of course, it would only make the situation worse. Again, people don't understand this because they actually think that inflation is an increase in prices. Of course, getting a check would help that, right? Here's the thing. Inflation is not increasing prices. That, my friends, is a symptom of inflation. Inflation, properly defined, is an increase in the money supply. It's more money being pumped into the economy. The powers that be have run a very successful propaganda campaign to redefine inflation. So, in effect, now most people think that a symptom of inflation, rising prices, is inflation. And as a result, most people have absolutely no clue where inflation is coming from. This was on purpose. You see, inflation is a matter of policy. Governments need to keep increasing the money supply in order to keep spending money. If it weren't for the Federal Reserve creating money out of thin air, the government wouldn't be able to maintain the massive welfare warfare state that we currently have now. This is the key thing to understand here. Key point. If you don't remember anything else that I say in this podcast, remember this. Nothing that the government does is free. You always pay. The government has no resources of its own. It produces nothing on its own. It can only operate based on the money that it takes from other people, us. There are really only two ways, essentially, that government can pay for spending. It can pay for spending through taxes, so it taxes you and then spends that money. Or it can pay for everything through borrowing. So in essence, when you borrows, it's really just pushing that tax bill down the road, right? It's going to tax you 10 years from now to pay for what it borrowed, or it's going to tax your kids or your grandkids. So it's really just kicking the can down the road. It's still taxes in the long run, but they can put it off by borrowing money. Now, the borrowing, that's where things really get dicey, because even with borrowing, the government is spending far more money than it can actually borrow realistically in the open market, right? There are people out there who are willing to lend governments money. They're willing to buy treasury bonds, government bonds, in order to finance government because they're going to get a little interest on it. And it's a good, safe investment, or at least that's what it's considered to be. But as with anything, I mean, there's a limited pool of that, right? There's a limited demand for government bonds. Everybody doesn't want government bonds, and obviously you don't want a billion jillion government bonds. So there is a limit. There's a demand limit there. As the government keeps supplying bonds, keeps supplying debt for people to buy, it has to give you more and more to entice you to buy it. So it has to drop the price of the bond and has to raise interest rates to entice you to buy more bonds. That's the nature of lending. And of course, as interest rates increase, that means that the government is having to pay more to borrow. That's not a good scenario. So you don't want rising interest rates if you're a government person. You want artificially low interest rates so that your borrowing costs are low so that you can keep this Ponzi scheme going for as long as possible. So what ends up happening is we have what's called debt monetization, and that's where the Federal Reserve comes in, the central bank. And effectively, what happens, putting this in simple terms, is the Federal Reserve, the central bank, buys government bonds. It buys U.S. Treasuries on the open market. It puts them on its balance sheet. And it does this by printing money out of thin air. Nice work if you can get it, right? Don't you wish you could print money out of thin air? Well, the central bank can do that. So what it does is it just writes a check. There's no money in any account anywhere, but it just writes a check. It creates money. And obviously, it's not really writing a check. It's doing all of this digitally. But, you know, in essence, that's what it's doing. It's writing a check, creating money. The bank gets this money that was created out of thin air, and the central bank, the Federal Reserve, gets these treasury bonds and it holds them on its balance sheet. Now, if it holds these forever, then the debt has been effectively monetized. That debt has been turned into money. That's what we mean. And so, therefore, the bank now has extra money. It can go out and lend that money out. It can give money away, whatever. It increases the amount of money in circulation. It increases the money supply. This is, by definition, inflation. It's not the rising prices, it's the creation of money. One of the symptoms of creating money is price inflation. You end up with more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services. The price of those goods and services in terms of dollars is going to rise. It's just a fundamental law. When you increase the money supply, if you don't increase the amount of goods and services, then you end up with rising prices. Now, that's not the only place that inflation shows up. Inflation can also show up in assets. So, for instance, the price of houses. We've seen this. We saw it leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, and we've seen it recently during the pandemic when rates went artificially to zero, mortgage rates went through the floor, people had easier ability to borrow money. That increases the demand for houses. The price of houses go up. It's asset price inflation. Same thing happens in the stock market. One of the reasons that we've seen such a run in the stock market, really since the 2008 financial crisis, is because for all of those years, the Federal Reserve has held interest rates artificially low, made it easier to borrow money, basically created a wealth effect, made everybody feel rich. Stock market goes up. The pandemic actually exacerbated this situation because during the pandemic, what happened is that while the government or the Fed was creating all of this money and pumping it into the economy, the government was handing out stimulus checks, right? Meanwhile, most people were sitting at home doing nothing. Production went through the floor. There was less goods, less services, but people still had money to go out and buy stuff. So it was obvious to anybody that this was going to cause price inflation. Now, the Fed, for a while, tried to say, no, this isn't going to cause inflation. Look, we did it in 2008, and it didn't cause any inflation. Of course, it did. It was in the stock market and asset prices. But this isn't going to cause a problem. And then they said, well, we're having a little bit of inflation, but it's transitory. It's nothing to worry about. And then pretty soon it wasn't transitory anymore, and here we are today. So when you start thinking through this, it becomes crystal clear why the powers that be would want to redefine inflation. Because if you define it as rising prices, well, you can blame price hikes on all kinds of things, right? You can blame supply chains. You can blame Putin. You could blame greedy corporations. You can blame oil companies. You can blame voodoo for that matter. There's all kinds of things that cause prices to go up. But when you accurately define inflation as an increase in the money supply, it becomes crystal clear who is to blame. It's the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government. They're the ones printing the money. Nobody else is printing money. It's the government. Economist Ludwig von Mises explained exactly why this definition of inflation is so pernicious. He wrote, "People today use the term inflation to refer to the phenomenon that is an inevitable consequence of inflation, that is the tendency of all prices and wage rates to rise. The result of this deplorable confusion is that there is no term left to signify the cause of the rise in prices and wages. There is no longer any word available to signify the phenomenon that has been up to now called inflation. As you cannot talk about something that has no name, you cannot fight it. Those who pretend to fight inflation are, in fact, only fighting what is the inevitable consequence of inflation, rising prices. Their ventures are doomed to failure because they do not attack the root of the evil. They try to keep prices low while firmly committed to a policy of increasing the quantity of money that must necessarily make them soar. As long as this terminological confusion is not entirely wiped out, there cannot be any question of stopping inflation." And the fact of the matter is, they don't really want to stop inflation. That's the dirty little secret, as I've already explained. They need it. The Federal Reserve pumped over $3 trillion into the economy after the 2008 financial crisis through quantitative easing. That's this bond buying that we've talked about. It also stimulated credit creation with 0% interest rates that lasted more than a decade. And then, of course, during the pandemic, the Fed doubled down, pumped nearly $5 trillion more into the economy, and then dropped interest rates to zero again. This was all predictable. Anybody who said they're surprised by rising prices in the wake of all of this money creation either doesn't understand economics or they're lying to you, one or the other. It was entirely predictable. So, in a nutshell, the Fed has devalued your money, and now everything costs you more. So let's call it what it is. It's theft, right? The government monetary policy steals from you. And you know who suffers the most from this? The poor and people on fixed incomes. The very people that everybody says, oh, we have to have government to take care of the poor. Without the government, the poor would just be trampled on. The government is trampling on the poor. This monetary policy, which is by design, hurts the poor and the most vulnerable the worst. Now, of course, there's nothing new under the sun, right? People in power have been stealing from everybody else for centuries. When you boil it all down, money printing is just a modern way of devaluing currency so the government has more. And it's been doing this for centuries. It's just easier now. You know, it used to be that in order for a king to devalue the money, he had to actually clip gold out of the coins and make the coins lighter, or mix other metals, copper or other alloys, into gold coins so that there was less actual gold. That's how they devalued money back in the day. And that was hard, and people noticed, oh my gosh, my coin's got a clip out of it, so people could see it. Today, you don't even see it. Federal Reserve just pushes a few buttons and voila, money just flowing out of nowhere. And it sounds great because, we got more money, we can buy more stuff. No. The key thing is the stuff. If there's not more stuff, there's not more stuff to buy. So if you're not making more stuff, then you have to have prices increase. It's just the way it is. And again, it's been doing it for centuries. It's just easier now. And it will continue, but it's important for you to understand it. Because, number one, you won't ask for stupid solutions like printing government checks, which just exacerbates the situation, right? Obviously, the government doesn't have stimulus money to hand out, so it's going to have to borrow more, which means more will have to be monetized, which means ultimately the Fed will have to create more money, which means that prices are going to go up even more in the future. So it's a temporary fix. And secondly, by talking about this, we can make people aware that we're being stolen from, and then maybe people would be just a little less inclined to praise government for helping them. Because, ladies and gentlemen, government ain't helping you. So I want to pivot from here and talk a little bit about this from a biblical perspective. But before I do that, I want to tell you about another new sponsor for the GodArchy podcast, Canna Hemp. That's Canna Hemp, and you can find them over at cannahemp.com. Now, have you ever been curious about CBD? CBD is a compound that is derived from hemp. It is basically the same plant species as marijuana, but CBD is not psychotropic. It doesn't make you high, doesn't have any impact on your brain, but it does have many benefits. Many people swear that it helps them with anxiety, helps them sleep better, and it has also been shown to be anti-inflammatory, and that's primarily my interest in it. I was diagnosed with arthritis about 3 or 4 years ago. As many of you know, I play hockey. I'm a goalie. Hip arthritis ain't good for a goalie. So I was looking for a way to continue playing to kind of help long-term deal with the inflammation and pain that is associated with arthritis, and to get off all of the ibuprofen and Aleve that I was taking, which of course isn't really good for your kidneys and your liver over the long term. A friend of mine who is in the business recommended Canna Hemp. They have a formulation that is specifically designed for anti-inflammation and pain relief. I started taking it, and honestly, I was able to almost completely wean myself off of those over-the-counter pain meds. In my experience, it definitely helps. Other people have had similar experience, and there are clinical studies that show the anti-inflammatory properties, the anti-anxiety properties of CBD. If you're interested in trying CBD products, I highly recommend Canna Hemp. It's what I use, and they are well known. They've been around a long time. They make their product to high standards, and again, for me, it's work. So check out everything that they have. not just for pain relief. They have stuff for anxiety. They have stuff for helping you sleep. They have some topical stuff, oral stuff, all kinds of products over at canahemp.com. And again, I'm going to help you out. You can get 15% off of your purchase using the promo code Michael15. So it's my name, Michael, and the number 15, Michael15. Check it out, canahemp.com. I'll link to it on the show notes page. And if you're interested in CBD, check it out. So let's look at this idea of monetary depreciation from a biblical standpoint. It's interesting because, I was thinking about this and thinking about doing this show, and it was kind of going through my head. There has to be some relation to money and honest weights and measures. And we know the Bible talks about the importance of honest weights and measures. And really, when you get down to it, money is nothing but a measure. It's a measure of value. It's a means of exchange. So if money has a consistent, predictable value, we can use it to exchange other goods. I can say that, these apples are worth X dollars, and this gasoline over here is worth X dollars. So we can make that exchange using dollars. A sound money allows us to make honest and fair transactions. But if the money is out of whack, then it skews and distorts the entire system of exchange. And really, that's what the economy is, right? The economy is about voluntary exchanges. And me having my needs met by meeting your needs. Money allows us to facilitate that. But the Federal Reserve, other central banks, other governments throughout history have manipulated the money to their benefit, which has skewed the economy, and it's really at its core unjust. I found an article, actually a friend of mine, Scott Pearson, who's an economics professor, posted this. It's called Theft by Inflation, The Sinful Manipulation of Weights and Measures, and is by Dylan Pauman and Alexander Williams Salter. And I'm going to link to it on the show notes page, and that's kind of where I pulled some of the information that I'm going to give you here. If you want to read that, you can get a much better, broader overview of what they're talking about. But one of the interesting things I pulled from this article is that there is a precedent for sound money in the Old Testament, particularly in Exodus. If you go to Exodus chapter 30, it's talking about a census. And God commanded that in this census, each person was ordered to pay a ransom for their lives. So it was basically a sin offering, right? Exodus 30:13 says, each one who crosses over those already counted is to give half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs. This half shekel is an offering to the Lord. So what in the world are they talking about here? What is the sanctuary shekel? Well, there was actually a shekel, which was a unit measure of money, in the temple. And it had a very precise weight, as this verse alludes to. So a shekel was a known weight by which money was measured. So in effect, we're talking about sound money here, right? According to one source that I found, a gerah has been traditionally measured as 1/50th of an ounce. So if we do the math, we find that a sanctuary shekel was equal to 0.4 ounce of gold. So that's 20 times 1/50th of an ounce. So in other words, this sanctuary shekel was a standard by which all of the shekels could be measured and created a foundation for sound money. So, if we look at this from a broader principle, devaluing money is a type of dishonest weight and measure. So we see this sanctuary shekel as an accurate measure of money. And we know that dishonest weights and measure are something that the Bible condemns. Leviticus 19:35, you shall do no injustice in judgment, in measurement of length, weight, or volume. Proverbs 20:10 drives this same point home. Diverse weights and diverse measures, they are both alike an abomination to the Lord. So what do we mean by diverse weights? Well, if we're saying that this standard of weight isn't equal to this standard of weight, they're diverse, or we have diverse measures. An inch is this much. I'm holding my fingers out. And then in this instance, an inch is this much, and I'm holding my fingers out bigger. Those are diverse weights and measures. You need a constant, consistent, predictable standard of weight and measure in order to have fair transactions. So if you look at it on the positive, this is also from Leviticus, you shall have a perfect and just weight, a perfect and just measure, that your days may be lengthened in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. So we normally think of this term kind of like honest scales, right? A dishonest weight would be if I have a scale, you think of the balance scale where you put thing on one side and you put the known weight on the other side, and then that tells you how much the thing weighs, right? If I put my thumb on the scale, well, you're going to think that your thing over here weighs more than it actually does. Or you can tip the scale the other way and make it seem like it actually weighs light. When you're measuring something like that, it makes people think they're getting more than you're really delivering. But the principle applies to money as well, right? If money is constantly being devalued, you can't have honest transactions. You can't measure the value of something if the government is constantly jerking around that standard of measure. That's why for many, many years we had a gold standard. A dollar was worth a certain amount of gold. It was predictable. It was set. People knew what they were getting, and it's exactly why Richard Nixon severed the last vestiges of the gold standard in the 1970s, because the federal government needed to be able to borrow more, and gold was leaving the United States because the dollar was being devalued against gold, and we couldn't have that. So basically, they just uncoupled it, and now the Federal Reserve can print however much money it wants to. It's very convenient. Interestingly, one of the early church fathers, St. John Chrysostom, used sound money as a metaphor in explaining the need for purity in our faith. He wrote, "As he who but partially pares away the image on a royal coin renders the whole spurious," and this is referring to this kind of clipping of coins, making the gold weight less, "so he who swerves ever so little from the pure faith soon proceeds from this to graver errors and becomes entirely corrupted." So he's using this idea of trimming coins, of devaluing coins, that just that little bit, it devalues the whole thing, and over time, the whole thing becomes entirely corrupted. That's our money system today. They have printed so much money that the entire system is corrupted. The entire system now depends on this easy money. The entire economy is addicted to the Federal Reserve printing money out of thin air. That's why when they take away this punch bowl, we're likely to see a major recession. We're going to see an economic crash in the future because now the Fed's like, oh no, we made too much inflation. People are upset about price increases. They're trying to raise interest rates. They're trying to slow that money creation down. That's putting a drag on the economy. Eventually, the economy is going to crash. At that point, the Fed is going to be faced with a choice. It's either going to have to let the economy crash, which would really be ideal in the long run because it would cleanse out all of the malinvestments and all of the misallocation of resources that we have in the economy today. But they're not going to do that because the political pain is too great. They will go back to inflation. They'll go back to money creation because, again, they can make excuses for rising prices. They can blame somebody else. Can't really blame anybody else when the economy is crashing. That's too obvious. So going back to this kind of biblical idea of sound money, theologian Juan de Mariana wrote his treatise on the alteration of money actually in response to the King of Spain debasing the currency. This was in the 1500s. He wrote, "If the king is the director, not the master, of the private possessions of his subjects, he will not be able to take away arbitrarily any part of their possessions for this or any other reason or any ploy. Such seizure occurs whenever money is debased, for what is declared to be more is worth less." That perfectly sums up what government is doing to our money. What is declared to be more is actually worth less. That's what we're seeing today. The government is stealing from you. And we know from the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal. Now, I argue that the government is stealing from you when it taxes you honestly. Honestly, I'm using air quotes there. Because you have not given your consent, and when somebody takes something from you without your consent, that's stealing. I'll link to an article in the show notes page that gets into the idea of taxation being theft. But certainly the devaluation of your money is theft. It's stealing your purchasing power. And again, you are suffering the consequences of this every single time you buy anything. And we need to understand this. We need to recognize it. When you hear, oh, greedy corporations are causing inflation, or inflation is good for you, or all of this BS that the government propagandists put out there, the government gaslighters, you have to understand the truth. Every time they print more money, whether it's for a stimulus check, whether it's to build a tank, whether it's to give away some corporate welfare, whether it's for Social Security, no matter what it's for, every time they print dollars out of thin air, it is taking away your purchasing power. Again, as I said earlier, nothing the government does is free. You always pay for it. You're going to either pay for it through a direct tax, your kids and grandkids are going to pay for it through taxes, or you're going to pay for it through the inflation tax. You're paying for COVID stimulus today through the inflation tax. If they were to pass a inflation stimulus today, you'd pay for that with the inflation tax in the future. Government is stealing from you. Don't let them tell you otherwise. So I hope there are two key takeaways that you will get out of this episode. Number one, nothing the government does is free. You always pay for it, either through direct taxation or through the inflation tax. And number two, inflation is not simply rising prices. Inflation is an increase in the money supply. It is an intentional policy. And one of the symptoms is an increase in prices. And again, it is stealing from you. That's the key. We need to understand this. We need to speak against this because we need people to understand that the government is not helping them, right? I've said that once already. That's very important. The government is not helping. It's hurting, and it's hurting by messing with honest weight and measure when it comes to money. So with that, we're going to wrap up this episode. Please check out my sponsors, Fox & Sons Coffee, Can of Hemp. Remember those promo codes? There will be information on the show notes page, and you can save yourself a little bit of money and get some good products in the process. Also, please remember to support GodArchy if you can financially. Just $5-10 a month would be very, very helpful to what we're doing here. Help us expand our reach. And also, please share the episodes, share the articles over at GodArchy.org. Very much appreciate any support and help that you can give. You are part of this podcasting community, so I hope you can kind of spread the word. And so that's it. Yeah, I hope you have a fantastic week or a couple of weeks ahead. I've got some exciting stuff that's coming up. I've hinted at this before. I'm hinting again. Tease. Next episode, you'll get some details. So tune in for that. And again, thanks so much for listening. I very much appreciate it. Peace and God bless. All right, it's time for the ending stuff. Again, thank you so much for listening to the show. Make sure you check out the website, GodArchy.org. You can sign up to our email list there. We're also on social media, on Facebook, at GodArchy.org. We're on the Twitters, at GodArchy. And you can also find us on MeWe. Just look for GodArchy. If you want to contact me, shoot me an email, info@GodArchy.org. And of course, you can support the show. Just go to GodArchy.org, hit the Support GodArchy button, follow the instructions. Again, we really value your listenership. That's all. There's no more. Just listen to the music.